Welcome to the Warrior Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Keller. Today on the podcast, I am speaking with my good friend, Ricky Rodriguez from Bombhouse Recording. Ricky and I have a long history that goes back over 30 years. We played in the band Four Man Furnace together. We have spent a lot of time on the road together. And honestly, he's one of my best friends in the world. During our conversation, Ricky and I talk about the 90s Christian music scene and the impacts it left on the Christian music industry. We talk about technology, recording, gear, work-life balance, and so much more. But before we get into the interview with Ricky, just a reminder that if you guys are enjoying the content here on the Warrior Podcast, please consider helping us out by donating in order to help keep this content coming, as well as many of the things we have planned for this year. We are a donation-supported organization, and it's people like you who donate that helps keep this content coming and helps us to help men be the husbands, fathers, and leaders in their homes and communities that God has called us to be. The link to donate will be in the show notes, so definitely consider helping us out. Also, make sure to check out our friends over at Ruddy Man Grooming who sponsor this podcast. Ruddy Man Grooming carries handmade goods that are designed to care for skin and facial hair, giving health and style to your beard or stash, all with amazing handcrafted scent profiles. And the best part is you'll look and smell your manliest while taking great care of yourself. Listeners of the Warrior Podcast will receive 15% off their first order by entering the code WARRIOR in the discount box at checkout at RuddyManGrooming.com. That's Ruddy, RUDDY, mangrooming.com. Make Ruddy Man products a part of your daily routine and start taming the beard, but not the beast. So with all that being said, I'm not going to keep you guys from Ricky any longer, so let's get to it. Ricky Rodriguez, welcome to the Warrior Podcast. Thanks for being on, my friend.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. Can't complain.
Good.
How's
Good.
things in
Same
the
here.
metropolis of Morganton, North Carolina?
Well, usually Tuesday mornings are like my text my clients morning.
Mm-hmm.
So probably sent about 20 this morning.
Yeah.
Just getting my schedule ready and everything ready for the studio. And then that's it, man. Then it's usually 2 or 3 sessions a day through
Wow.
Saturday. Yep.
Grind, huh?
Yeah, man. I
Yeah.
wouldn't have it any other way.
Huh?
I'm very thankful to be able to do what I do for a
Yeah.
living. You know,
Well, man, just to give a little bit of backstory to the audience on our history, me and you, crazy enough to think about this, but we go back now over 30 years.
it's wild.
As it is wild. We played in multiple bands together throughout the 90s. The main one, of course, being the band Four Man Furnace.
Yeah, baby.
We have spent countless hours on the road together, making music together, going through life together. You were in my wedding.
Yep.
You're one of the closest friends I've, been blessed to have. And so our conversation today, man, it's going to be real. It's going to be fun. It's going to be very music focused, very technology focused. We're going to talk, about the music industry, particularly the Christian music industry. And, I'm really looking forward to this. I think me and
Well,
you kind
can
of
I
in a
can I
roundabout
say
way.
can I say something personally,
Yeah,
real fast?
absolutely.
So, over the years, man, I was talking to my wife. We're kind of in the empty nester phase, getting
Yeah,
there, right? We have our youngest is in college, so. But I was thinking
it's
about my
crazy.
long-term friendships and just over the years from youth group, high school, and honestly, the strongest friend group today came from Four Man Furnace. Like came from that
Absolutely.
band, specifically you,
Yeah,
and like that influence, like those friendships matter so much to me now more than ever.
yeah,
So I just want to let you know that, man. Like
yeah, man.
it means so much to me that we kind of get to work together a little bit with the
Yeah,
podcast, right?
absolutely.
I
Yep,
get to master those,
yep.
and just listening to them and listening to your heart and what you're doing in ministry, it's unique. Just wanted to encourage you when the audience is listening. You're listening to somebody that cares, and he's been like this his whole life. So,
Thanks, brother. I
yep.
appreciate that, man. Feelings definitely mutual. Ain't no doubt about it. So, let's start really by giving the listeners who don't know you, an idea of what you currently do. Of course, you're a musician,
Yep.
incredible, crazy guitar player. You're a producer, you're a mix engineer, a songwriter, you're a dad, you're a
Oh
husband,
yeah.
and you're also a diehard Miami Dolphins fan. A fact
Die
that
Hard,
we
man.
pick on you a lot about, but we don't hold it against you.
There's the
Yep, he's got the
tattoo
tattoos to
right
show it,
there.
man.
Like the old school. It's the
Yep,
old school
old
logo. I'm
school
gonna point
tats.
that out.
Yep.
So okay.
But yeah,
So
fill in if you don't
yep.
mind, man. Fill in the gaps of what all those roles actually mean.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So let's get down to this. So my name is Ricky Rodriguez. Everybody calls me Ricky Rod these days.
Yep.
It's just a lot easier to say that. So I currently own and operate a recording studio out of Western North Carolina. Specifically, the town's called Morganton. So I have been doing this now. Man, I have been recording since I met Matt 30 years
Yep.
ago. I was recording like on a 4-track cassette player, sending out demos with me just shredding all over them. It's kind of crazy to go back and listen to those, but and then going that far back, so we're talking like early 90s,
Yeah.
right? Like
Definitely.
early to mid 90s,
Yeah. Early.
and
Yeah.
got started back then. I would help us record demos with 4-man furnace, and then that just kind of multiplied into like recording demos for friends of ours,
Yep.
and then over the years, it just grew into something that I realized I was like, okay, wait a second, this is turned into something way more than I had expected, and I think two things had something to do with that. The music industry changed a lot when we were able to get really good recordings at home, right?
Right.
With technology. Not to get too technical, but there's such good software and every kid now has a Mac laptop or an iPad or a phone, and GarageBand is free.
Yeah.
You can just record on that,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
So, but anyway, I think technology helped me along the way. Number one, I'm not scared of it. I love it,
Right.
kind of embrace it. And having the technology we have now mixed with, when you have Billie Eilish, for example, when she made her huge, at the time, biggest record, they did it at home on Logic, you
Yeah.
know, and it was professionally mixed, professionally
Right.
mastered. But when Billboard is putting out articles and you're seeing on Twitter them talking about that, I think the stigma has just completely gone away, right?
Right.
And then of
Right.
course with the pandemic, we have bands putting out recordings now that were all done remotely. I just finished a
Yeah.
record for a very mutual friend of ours, Yogi, right?
Oh
He's
yeah.
in a killer band, right? So
Yes, he
shout out
is.
to World Gone
Yeah.
Cold, but that
Absolutely.
record was done like all over the place, right?
Right.
Drums were done literally in my studio, which is like a
Right.
converted garage, right?
Right.
But this record, like it's nuts, and you go listen to that record, it sounds awesome,
Yeah.
right?
It does.
But that's where we are now, and I think that kind of helped keep me busy,
Right.
in the studio and not being afraid to try different styles of music either,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
So
Let's go back, all the way back to little Ricky Rod, and let's and
all right,
tell everybody
so
a little
I
bit about your family
so
history. Because your
so
parents
I
came
am
here from Cuba.
yeah, I'm Cuban.
Yep.
I do understand Spanish. I do feel like if you throw me in a Spanish speaking country, I will be okay after about a day or two.
Right.
But my wife she's super American,
Yes,
super
she
super
is.
super American. She's from this area. So, but my family immigrated here the late 50s, early 60s from Cuba.
Right.
So that was right when Castro kind of took over. I guess he was like late 50s, 1959. So
Right.
that generation of Cubans that came to Miami, um, majority were professionals, educated, and business owners,
Right.
which was my family, right, on both sides. So they both came here. We grew up with stories of them having nothing, right? And starting businesses from scratch. So I just grew up in a family of entrepreneurs, man. That's like what my dad always did, just kind of worked for himself and did some really cool stuff over the years. And then eventually he moved us up to Western North Carolina to a small town called Lenore, kind of weird out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
To this day, I never understood why we moved out there that way. But so they moved us up here when I was in elementary school, going into middle school, and the music bug bit me maybe like fifth grade. But I grew up with a dad that when he got saved, he came out of Catholicism.
Right.
A lot of Cubans were Catholic. Catholics
Right.
kind of drove the social systems in Cuba back then. We're talking the Catholics handled the medical system, the school system, everything in those small towns. So my dad got saved in the 80s, started going to like a small Methodist church, and then eventually we found a local Assemblies of God church. And I kind of just grew up playing like drums for him until we found a drummer. Then I would play bass. And when we found a bass player, I would play guitar. I just played whatever,
Yeah.
and he had me on stage at a very young age, and the music bug kind of just bit me when I got into middle school.
So, what were some of the ways? I mean, I had the privilege, of getting to know your parents pretty well. What were some of the and great people? I mean,
Yeah.
uh,
Incredible. Yeah.
yeah,
Very
incredible people.
influential in this
Yeah.
area.
And what were some of the ways they did influence you?
Man, I would say spiritually, the biggest influence in my life was my mother. My mother passed away. My son is like almost 20, and he was about 3 when she
Right.
passed away. And that was a tough loss for our
Yeah.
family.
Yep.
But I think anybody would tell you that she was the person that would invite you immediately to the house.
Right.
She would make you a meal,
Yes,
like
she
not
would.
just like a snack, like a meal.
Yep.
And I just think it's great. Like when I started dating my wife, Tyson, she just thought it was crazy that my wife or that my mom was fixing fresh breakfast, every morning. We had fresh biscuits. It was hilarious. But that was my
Right.
mom. She was very much a servant, especially family. And faith was just something that was a big part of my life. They were, there's that small percentage that always does 90% of the work at the church, right? At
Right.
your local church. They were always that family,
Right.
and we kind of just, I grew up being at our church 4 days a week, and but my family, I would say the biggest influence I saw from them is, you know, consistency, man, just day in and day out. Faith never wavered. And number two, I would say just, um, we had some tough times. My mom's health was tough. When your dad is in small business, that's tough.
Yeah.
And we went through some tough times.
Right.
But something we were always close,
Right.
and still close to this day. My dad,
Right.
I talk to him multiple times a day. Still, we're in business together. You know, and I think they just instilled into me early on the values of faith and the value of really, um, you know, being real, if that makes any sense.
Oh
I
yeah.
grew up with my dad was doing seminars in like the 90s and 80s about the
Right.
evils of rock music,
Right.
which is kind of ironic
It
now,
is.
considering how much when I was 16, I was like buying everything I could. He took
Right.
every one of my STP CDs multiple times. But, we've talked about that since then, by the way.
Right.
And he's like, hey, he's backtracked a little bit. He was like, it's
Mhm.
been, it's more about, hey, how not letting the world, not living to the world standards,
Right. Right.
and separating ourselves more than
Right.
the evils of rock and roll music,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, because, anyway,
Yeah.
that was my childhood.
Right. And you mentioned that you first started taking an interest in music in fifth grade. What were some of the early musical influences you had? Like what was it about music and the
Well,
artists,
when you
that
grow
really
up in
piqued
a
your
house,
interest?
that doesn't allow secular music, it could be slim pickings,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Especially
So,
that time
and
period.
yes, and we had, in a small town we lived in, we had a mall, the Lenora Mall, right? And they had a
Yep.
Christian bookstore,
Yep.
and let's just say their Christian music selection was not the best there,
Uh,
right? It
yep.
just wasn't good.
Right.
Um, but I would say growing up, probably the two bands as a kid that I just fell in love with was a Christian metal band called Striper and then
Right.
Petra.
Yep.
Petra was like one of the, first of all, they were the only kind of band you can find at the
Really?
time
Yeah, they were.
early on
Yeah.
that sounded good. They actually sounded like Def Leppard, which was
Yep.
hilarious
It
going back
was.
to it, listening to it now. But they did sound like the bands that were kind of early 90s and 80s, right?
Right. Yep.
And then there was a label at the time called Pachyderm Records,
Mhm.
right? That
Yep.
had my favorite band, Guardian, right?
Yes. Yep.
And they
Same
were
here.
kind of, and oh my gosh, like as a kid, hearing those kinds of bands, uh, being Christian music and liking music as much as we did, I
Right.
was just instantly drawn to that,
Yeah. And,
like big
I
time.
kinda speak on that too. The very first, Christian concert after I became a Christian, the first one I ever went to was Petra. I went and saw Petra in Charlotte, and I was like and there was that's when it really I mean, I'd always loved music, but,
Was that in a church?
that's yes, it was at, what was
I
that big
think I was
church in
there.
Charlotte at the time?
I think
Um,
I was there. I think
you
I was at that
probably
same show.
were. That's
Yeah,
crazy. But, yeah,
I
that's when
remember
it
it was
really
loud.
first hit me too.
Was
That
it
was
like
the
super
first
loud?
yeah, it was very loud.
Yeah, I
Yep,
remember that. Yep, I
yep,
was there.
yep. Um, so yeah, that I mean, that was definitely when I really felt like that was what I wanted to do. It's
Oh
crazy.
yeah,
Don't even think me and you had ever talked about the fact that we might have been there at the same time. But yeah, I definitely
that's
could
kind
see
of
us
crazy,
being
but I
yeah,
remember that show, and I
yeah,
remember it being in Charlotte.
yep. Um, so you started recording the music you wrote very early on. And of course, things are a lot different now than they were back then. Share a little bit about what you had to work with. Like what did the recording stuff look like back in those really early days?
Well, so we can backtrack a pretty good way
Yeah,
because my dad had gear in the house while I was growing up. So back in the day, there was only really two companies building stuff for the home, and it was Tascam and Fostex, right?
right.
And they had like
Mhm.
these 4-track reel to reel recorders. Eventually,
Yep.
that technology changed to like 8 tracks, right?
Right.
And then I feel like around my 6th grade or 7th grade year, maybe 6th grade, my dad took me to Reliable Music, which was the big local music store in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Right.
And we bought a 4-track cassette player. I bought a Doctor 550 drum machine, right? And that was all I needed. Like,
Right.
I figured how to sequence on that.
Yep.
I had a cheapo amp, little crate amp in my house, and I just started, I remember I would record ideas. I'd be like, "Hey," I would hear, Joe Satriani song or something like
Right.
that. I'd be like, "Hey, I'm gonna try to, like, make this my own kinda thing," and then friends at church, every once in a while, somebody would be like, "Hey, we kinda need a soundtrack in a different key." They didn't wanna go buy it, so I would just make one at home
Right.
with the drum machine, and they actually came out pretty, like, decent, but, that's what it looked like. It was just very like, no studio monitors. I was
Right.
using stereo speakers
Yep.
at the time. I don't think I got real studio monitors till, like, early 20s, I think. Just,
Yeah.
just back then it was just I was using headphones and whatever I can find. Like my dad
Right.
had a stash of microphones but it was very just all drum machine for me. It was all um that kind of just learning drum beats from verses of songs that I listened to. And then, I mean, we even did. I mean, I did crazy stuff. I would record like 3 tracks, bounce them to one, record two, bounce them to one, record.
Yep.
It was just nuts.
Yep. I
Back
remember
in
that,
those
I think.
days.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, it was kind of crazy.
Yeah. And, by the time we first met back in the early 90s, music was really transitioning from the hair metal bands of the 80s, that we grew up listening to into the alternative, grunge rock scene that very much influenced bands like us and really set the stage for an era in music, especially Christian music that really was a very special time, one that
Man,
produced some amazing bands,
I
some
could
that come to the
argue.
top of my head, right off the top of the bat, MXPX, Plank Eye, The Prayer Chain.
Yep,
And then on top of that, there was an emergence of Christian venues that were popping up all over the United States where these
yep.
bands would play and attract people who were not your average church going kids. What do you think was the driving force behind this era of Christian music?
Man, you know, when Nirvana
Yep.
first hit,
Smells
right?
like Teen Spirit.
Yeah, that changed the music scene
It did.
greatly, and I will argue, and I would agree, we could agree on this, that era, even though it's considered classic now,
Yeah.
it's still my favorite,
Oh,
period.
yeah.
Like, it doesn't
Absolutely.
nothing in my opinion, we're still like, I'm still in here at the studio with drummers, and we're referencing Foo Fighter songs from the
Yep.
'90s, you
Right.
know? Like, it's just it is what it is. That's how influential that era is. And man, I mean, I remember hearing rumors about Seattle bands
Mhm.
before Nirvana kicked in.
Right.
But the thing that changed it, I think, for the Christian industry big time was, I would say, Tooth and Nail Records,
Yep.
right? Like they released. We would go. We would. What was it called? The Carpenter Shop up in
Yep.
Asheville.
It was.
It was like the only really good Christian music place to find stuff
And
ever.
correct me if I'm wrong, Wish for Eden was the first. That
Yes.
was really the first one, wasn't it?
Yes, and it was produced by
Yeah.
Mike Knott,
Yep.
which is kinda crazy,
Yes, it
and
is.
that was a straight up, like, Seattle drop D grungy
Yes.
stuff, and I just fell in love with
Yep.
that sound because in Christian music, it just didn't,
Didn't
uh
exist.
no, it didn't, and it was low budget. They
Yep.
weren't super produced records, and that I would say I think I still have like the first 20 CDs, I think, of those Tooth and Nail records that came out. I
Right.
still have them because
Wow.
that's how much they over the years I would go back and listen. People don't remember now, but MXPX got started back then.
Yes.
When we met them, they were what, 16 years old,
Yes. Yes.
right? They were
They
traveling in
were.
the back of a van, like
Yep.
sleeping in a van. It was crazy, and that industry, like, it eventually blew up. Like, it did great, right?
Right.
You can argue that Tooth and Nail became probably the most influential label for, like, what,
Yeah.
10, 15 years?
Absolutely.
I mean,
Definitely.
I remember bands. I mean, we went through that with our band, right?
Right.
Like, we were watching all of our friends get signed, and it turned out all the deals they were getting were really not great,
No, it
right?
wasn't.
No,
Yeah.
it wasn't. But that era really, I mean, we wouldn't have modern day, we wouldn't have had DC Talk, right?
Right.
There wouldn't have been no Toby Mac,
Right.
right? If it wasn't for that era,
Right.
really.
Yeah.
And it says a lot for the ones that have stuck around over the years, like Michael W. Smith
Yeah.
kind of changed things up a little bit. They all kind of adjusted, but the overall thing is, you could argue that the Christian music industry was the healthiest it ever was, probably in the '90s.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you think the 90s Christian music scene um, shaped the faith and spirituality of its listeners? And, what impact do you think it had on the wider Christian community? Because, like I mentioned a minute ago, this era really pulled in a group of individuals who are not your typical church going kids.
Oh no. I
So,
mean, you
how do
can.
you think it helped shape them?
Well, I will tell you this, man. And growing up in the South, I would consider this the South, and going to church here, right? We were lucky because we got to visit other churches and
Yes, we
like
did.
see healthy places, see like healthy church culture.
Right.
But for the most part, the church I grew up in never wanted us to listen to that stuff on youth trips.
Right.
We were not supported at all. And I think what it did was drive in at that time the fringe, right? The people that wouldn't really consider going to the local stuffy Baptist church at the time.
Right.
There were no modern churches back then. Like
Yeah,
it
there
just
wasn't.
wasn't. Actually, the churches that were doing like the best music were typically like the Pentecostal or Assemblies of God maybe type of churches, or you even had some non-denominationals back then, but
Right.
it was very rare, right?
Right.
Music wasn't such a big part of church culture at the time. You had some praise and worship stuff, but musically, musician wise, we didn't look at it as good. I remember that. I didn't
Right.
think it was like, it was not
No.
the thing I was listening to. I know that,
No.
right,
Definitely
in the
not.
'90s. But you could say that it reached an entirely different demographic, bro.
Yeah.
Like it was a demographic today that the church really can't reach, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You can argue that, you
No,
know,
I agree completely.
because I mean, we saw it firsthand. You know, as you said earlier, there was a whole scene of clubs, right?
Yeah.
Like Christian clubs, and we got to cause drama in those
Yes,
clubs.
we
You know,
did.
and it was just funny to me that that was really where I saw ministry really happen, right? Because it was really those people that really reached out to people that would never have gone to church.
Right.
It's not like it is today where church has become a very production driven event, right?
Right.
But it all goes back to the 90s. I don't care what
Yeah.
anybody says.
Absolutely.
So, but production wise, like musically, technically, I mean, the influence is endless from that
Yeah.
scene, in
Yeah.
my opinion.
Yeah.
You know,
And I've had quite a few conversations with previous band members from that era. And even guys like I interviewed Vic Kusha, who we played at his place at the
yeah, man,
warehouse, and he talked a lot about the struggles he faced just trying to get that club that he ran, the warehouse, trying to get the support from the people at his church because they didn't want those types of kids and those types of people who were playing in the bands coming in there during that
yeah,
time.
those
And
types of
and
people. I've heard that often.
yeah, those types of people. Yeah, and it was sad, and like you said, it was a group of kids that were being reached that nobody else was reaching, and those group of kids still exist today. And I don't think they're being reached today. Not like they were back then.
No, that is one thing where I don't want to sound negative about the current music industry.
Right. Right.
Don't interpret what I'm about to say as, oh, Rick's got a bad attitude about it. It's not that.
Right.
It's
Right.
just I saw an era that was very different in the 90s than what we see today, and what I
Yeah.
feel like what we see today are Christian sponsored shows, right?
Yep.
It's usually the same promoter. There's not a lot of promoters doing them these days. And it's like a club,
Hmm.
the youth groups, most youth groups these days are a lot smaller than what we grew up with.
Yeah.
They're not as it's completely different world with that. And then they'll have their winter jam events that they go to, and they'll see Skillet. That'll be the heavy band, right? And then there'll be a bunch of pop stuff, and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
They
You're right.
they're just seeing this really small picture. They're when we were in our late teens and 20s, we got to see, like, man, like, just imagine, like, Cornerstone Festival,
Yeah.
for example, like the amount
Yes.
of talent and the bands we got to see. One of my favorite people, just a band called Rocket Boy,
Oh
right,
yeah.
from Georgia. Like, just the fact that we got to see those guys so much, I love them. Like, I
Yeah.
was legit a fan of them, and
Yeah.
we got to play with them so much, you
Yes.
know. But that doesn't exist today.
No, it
It's
doesn't.
just it's kind of a bummer.
It is.
It is. I mean, no offense to Skillet, bro. I mean, they're killing it. They're doing
Yeah.
great, but that's not what we saw in the 90s.
No,
It's
not
just,
at all.
it just wasn't just very, very different world, and it's just, to me, it's just very shallow.
Yeah.
You know, to
No, I
me, it's just
agree.
shallow.
Me and you had firsthand insight into a lot of the challenges, the struggles, and the difficulties of being in a band during this time period, especially the quote unquote Christian band. From your perspective, talk about some of the dark aspects of the Christian music scene during this time, because it was not always the glamorous life that many
Oh
thought it
no,
was.
oh no, no, man. Like, the fact was, it's when I think about it now, we just jumped in a van. We got a van,
Yep.
right? And we just went and gigged, right?
Yep.
We just went out, and back then churches would bring us in, uh, and also the concert promoter situation kind of exploded, right? Like, we got to play a lot of different clubs. There was some great, very healthy places to play, but the fact is, a lot of that industry, a lot of those bands just mirrored the struggles that was happening in the mainstream world, right?
Yeah.
Drugs,
Right.
just relationship issues, man. That we saw a lot of controversies
Yeah.
especially with tooth and nail,
Yes.
with language being used on records,
Right.
and it was, I mean, I felt like they always had a controversy,
Yeah.
right? It was always something. And the fact is, when you have, people, some of these people may have just gotten saved, right? Like literally just come to the Lord. We can't expect like the maturity of a 30-year-old Christian to handle the road, right?
Right.
It's just not going to happen, and things happen, right? And we
Yep.
saw a lot of that stuff over the years. And it, nowadays we have cancel culture. Things were much slower in the '90s, but it still happened.
Right.
Ironically, I see the same thing happening today with pastors, right,
Right.
and worship leaders. Kind of ironic, but some
Yeah.
of the same, you see the same issues then kind of pop up today, you know.
Yeah.
But man, but just for us, I remember for us, man, it was very much ministry driven, and it was not about money.
Right.
Money was just not something that was, it just, we basically did everything on our own.
Yeah, we did. And it wasn't about money, but we still one of the things that I remember that was one of the biggest struggles was people wouldn't a lot of times wouldn't want to pay us.
Oh man.
And it wasn't because we hadn't gone and done, what we were, brought there to do is, we would go and we would, and whoever the concert promoter was after the show was over, they'd be like, hey, we just don't have enough money to pay you today.
Yep.
And those kind of things were, I mean, when you depend on that money to get from one venue to the next, that can be challenging.
Didn't happen. And we had merch. Like
Yeah.
our drummer was like the best graphic
Yes.
designer on the planet. So our
Yeah.
merch always looked better
It
than
was
anybody
it
else's.
rocked. Yeah. Shout out to
It
Ledbetter.
was awesome. Yeah, it was always great. But and even like going back and listening to those demos and listening to the stuff that we recorded, that stuff was really ahead of its time in a lot
It
of
was.
ways.
Yeah.
And it's kind of fun to go back, but when you think about it, Matt, like, what bands around here were doing what we were doing? Nobody. There
Nobody.
was nobody doing what we
Right.
were doing here.
Right.
And the only band that was doing something was there was, Andy Elliott, shout out to Andy Elliott, Elliott Guitars, but
Yep.
he had a band called Snow White, which
Yep.
I was playing bass for, kind of
Yeah, you
grew up
did.
in it, and they were awesome, but they were like
Yeah.
classic rock,
They were.
Christian rock, and they were awesome, but when I left that, I wanted to do something completely different and original and creative,
Right.
which is what eventually became Four Man, which
Right.
was, we were very much about the art. We were not about writing singles, and we weren't about,
Right.
it. I think we may have gotten there eventually, maybe. I don't know, but we, you know, it was creatively probably one of my favorite times,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
we practiced so much,
We
like we
did.
woodshedded so much, like people don't realize, like, we played hours,
We
you
did.
know, it's just legit hours. And that's kind of
Yep.
where I learned like how to do what I do,
Yeah,
it just took, it was just
it
crazy good
was.
times. But
It was.
back to the spiritual health though, like I feel like we were a strong group of friends,
Yeah.
and we had the normal struggles of anybody else, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I know personally, going back and thinking about what I thought was a struggle, now I'm like, man,
Yeah.
that was nothing, It was just, honestly, I would attribute it mostly to like lack of maturity,
Yeah,
right? Not
absolutely.
really understanding what you're looking at, the situation.
Yeah. And I mean, even to this day, I have a very few select group of friends that have been lifelong friends of mine, and and there's a lot of bands who travel together and they end up fighting and they end up breaking up and never talking to each other. I mean, the four of us have remained close
Yep.
for as long as we've known each other. I mean, and to the point to where one of my mom, this, my mom passed away in November, and one of the first people that I contacted was you, Brian, and Charles, and
Yeah.
and uh, those friendships mean the world to me, like you mentioned earlier. I mean, and the older that we get, it becomes more relevant. Feels like.
You're right, man. There's a value to camaraderie in relationships that something I took for granted. I think
Yeah.
um, it's something I took for granted earlier in my years, and being around musicians all the time, and now like I'm more of a mentor role of where I'm at musically, because most people, people around here don't. Some people remember me from old bands, right?
Right.
But nowadays, a lot of people just associate me with Elevation
Right.
Church. Oh, you play at Elevation. Yeah, I do.
Right.
Still play guitar, still doing it as an old guy.
Right.
But I'm a mentor, right?
Right.
Like I'm helping. We have so much young talent and such young musicians. My role is just more as a mentor, you know,
Right.
and I'm watching a lot of these guys walk through very similar things of what I walked through
Right.
in my 20s.
Right.
Let's just be honest. We're musicians.
Yeah.
When good opportunities come by, people are gonna take them, you
Yeah.
know. And but I will say, I do feel like because of YouTube and probably like social media influence, which I'm not a big fan of social media. Actually,
Right.
90% of it I hate.
Yeah.
Uh, but but the the good that's in it is really good because we have a generation of young musicians finding some good people,
Right.
right? Telling them the stuff they need to hear. Not
Yeah.
not only musically, but even spiritually.
Right.
Of how to handle yourself and maturity wise. And there's some good stuff out there, but for the most part, man, woo, thankful. There's just a lot of value in relationships and building teams,
Yeah.
right? And I think we built such a strong team, we didn't even realize it.
Right. I
Right?
believe we
We
did.
just didn't. We just didn't, and thank God it accidentally happened. But when I go back and look at that, it did,
Right.
because there's situations now like, I mean, I work with bands every year, and I want to still be friends with these bands, even if they go on to work with uh, other producers, or they stop, they change directions in life. A lot of that's happened over the years. My clients are more my friends, and they need to know that I support them more personally, right? And
Right.
of course musically, but they need to know when they talk to me that, hey, I'm worried about them, right?
Right. Right.
And I feel like as a band and our friendships, like it's always been more about that,
Yeah, it has.
you
And
know.
it was so good, for those of you who haven't heard me mention this before, the intro to the podcast was actually recorded by Four
Yeah,
Man Furnace. And we got back together. It was the first time we had been together in like 22, 23
yeah,
years as far as recording. I mean,
yeah,
but just being able to get together again after all those years and do what we love to do together and,
yeah.
just
It came out
record,
good.
it was a great day.
Came out good, man.
It did come
And
out good.
listening to that, it's great to listen to it because it kind of finally, like nowadays with technology, it kind of sounds in my head like how I
Right.
wanted to back
Back
then,
then. Right.
But now, fast forward 20 plus years of experience,
Yeah.
I can get I can get the tone there faster
Right.
in my head, right?
Right.
Like when I'm
Right.
hearing, oh, we can get there faster,
Right.
Yeah.
And we kind of alluded to this earlier, but and I think I know me and you would agree that the Christian music industry is a lot different today than it was when you and I were actively involved in it from a traveling, band aspect. It doesn't seem to have the purpose and the passion and the heart and the impact that it had back in the 90s. Today's Christian artists don't seem to have really, and just say this because I can't think of a better way to say it, but today's Christian artists don't seem to have the same type of cult like following, I guess you could
Oh no,
say, that the bands of that era had. And I know a lot of people who listen to the Christian artists of today would, they'd probably disagree with me on that statement, but most who would disagree with me on that, more than likely were not a part of that time period. So they really, they
no,
don't,
because
they can't understand what I'm talking about.
they have no reference,
They
right?
don't.
They have no reference. So,
Right.
um, man, I can point to a few examples, but we can talk about the modern state of Christian music today. Pretty simple.
Yeah.
And there's two things that happened when you have Sony, you have Capitol, and I believe Universal. I think those are the three
Right.
biggies in the mainstream world, right? So All three of those, uh, 10, 15, 20 years ago, started buying up all the Christian labels,
Right.
right? We had a very good friend that owned Flicker Records, right?
Yep. Mhm.
Right. So Flicker was
Right.
owned by a couple of guys in a band called Audio
Audio
Adrenaline.
adrenaline.
So they sold to Sony, right? And when that peg fell,
Yeah.
like all of a sudden, all of these kind of like labels putting out these cool bands all got signed. They all got picked up by either Capitol or Universal. So basically, when all three of the biggies got into the Christian music world and started putting profits basically over everything,
Right.
which is it's business.
It
People need
is.
to realize it's very
Right.
much a business. It choked out all the bands that were kind of mid tier. Budgets
Right.
for Christian records back in those
Right.
days, really honestly, still today, it's like $20,000.
Right.
Mainstream bands had $500,000 back then, just for their first record.
Right.
And Christian bands were making records on $20,000. You know, which sounds a lot to us, but it's not a lot, to be honest, in this world.
Right.
And eventually, I mean, I'm talking like within 3 or 4 years of Sony buying Flickr, right? And all those, I mean, the trend just started nosediving down, like the amount of original bands coming out, right?
Right.
And then we had what, recession went 2009, right? 2008, 9,
Yeah.
10, where we
Yeah.
had a pretty rough recession.
Right.
Well, all of all of those bands died. Touring pretty much on the Christian world kind of died, right? And what I saw happen was you had all these artists, right, up and coming artists, vocalists. Instead of going to the mainstream world, they started getting hired on at churches, right?
Right.
Churches started hiring up quote unquote worship leaders, right?
Right.
And some of them were like treating it like a gig,
Yeah.
honestly, and not as a ministry, right? Or a pastoring kind of situation. It was just honestly, you had guys that probably belonged in Nashville or LA taking jobs at churches because they needed to feed their families, is essentially what we saw
Right.
happen. And then pretty much these churches, you can map out in the Christian world like what worship music sounds like today by the coast of the United States. We got
Right.
West Coast, you got East
Right.
Coast, right? And then you've got Australia, right? It kind of all fits in that genre, but that's where it all went. Honestly, that's kind of where the industry has moved to. It's all moved to worship. And it's not just like, oh, it's this one artist. It's actually more of a group now, right? Like a collective almost. And that's where we are now. And personally, nothing against that. I think there's churches putting out some incredible music. There's been incredible music coming from churches since the 90s.
Right. Yeah.
Honestly,
Yeah.
like you go back and listen to the old Matt Redman, like
Yeah.
old stuff, like the old stuff coming from England was incredible, like delirious
Delirious.
old
Yeah. That.
stuff. Excellent, like influential. Like they were, when I heard them, I was like, oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Like
It was.
legit. It was so good to hear that good of a band not be ashamed of what they were doing with in
Right.
that worship genre, right?
Right.
But churches now, there's a lot of um man, I mean, there's a lot of money there, right? And that's kind of where it's all pushed to now, and then there's just very little going on under that, you know. Labels
Right.
these days are more interested in singles, with artists, they'll put out a single over a record any day.
Right.
And what you are seeing, well, I think you've seen some Christians creatively just stay in the mainstream world on purpose, because knowing that that world musically just isn't going to work for them, right?
Right.
Which is kind of sad. It's kind of sad, but the fact is, like, that's where we are in the Christian industry. And I would have to look up the tour statistics, but I would venture to say it's probably the worship world bringing in the majority of the tickets
Yeah.
revenue these
Right.
days.
Yeah.
Definitely not, DC Talk back in the day when they signed their first major label deal. That was a huge number. They became millionaires,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Well, somebody did,
Yeah.
but it was a huge deal for Christian music. And then Michael W. Smith, I don't know how many records he sold, but it's a stupid amount of records, right? They're still doing this at a different level, but they're working with a crowd that's been a fan of theirs since the 80s, right?
Right.
Like that's kind of their crowd. I'm a little worried, like what's going to move these things, like what's going to happen 20 years from now?
Right.
Is it still going to be like church worship stuff? We don't know. I don't know, but it's kind of a bummer. It's kind of a bummer. And honestly, when I have people hit me up about, hey, I want to do some Christian music, I'm like, hmm, do you? like
Right.
like are you doing worship? Because if
Right.
you're doing worship, like we have a very like small creative window, right? Like that creative window needs to be like right here. Nothing against that. I'm
Right.
just saying this is kind of where we have a time. This is a box. We got to work in this box, right?
Right.
And I can tell you story after story of people that, at least artists, that kind of try to break into that world. It just didn't work great. They purposely started writing music from their heart more than purposely for Christians, and they've taken off, right?
Right.
And they've done great. Their values are still there. They're still believers. Nothing's changed there. It's just musically, I think people just don't want to hear. They don't want to hear a rock band anymore. You know, in Christian music, I'm sorry, like it's moved to the metal industry.
Yeah,
Metal,
you're right. It
Christian metal's
has.
been awesome, right?
Yeah.
But they'll all say the same thing. Um, could we argue the last Christian metal band to do mainstream well was POD?
Yeah, I would say
Right? Can
so.
we argue that? So,
Yeah,
and
I
they're
would say
still at it.
so. Yeah,
They're
they
still
are.
at it. So,
Yeah.
but they had huge mainstream crossover and kept it, and never, in my opinion, they kind of never strayed from their beliefs ever.
Right.
You know, they've
Yep.
they've been they've been at it for forever, right? They're
Yep.
huge,
Yeah.
but and they kind of did it outside of that system, which is what's more impressive. People don't realize how impressive that is, but I mean, how many bands did we grew up listening to in the '90s that we loved that should have been huge,
Yeah. Oh, a
right?
lot. Yeah.
Tons, in my
Absolutely.
opinion. I mean, they should have been huge. I mean, Guardian, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
classic records. They should still be recording today,
They should.
but they just kind of never hit.
They never could get past that one hurdle
Yes,
that
yeah.
would they just never could
I
do
mean,
it.
even
And
even Striper, who had huge mainstream success,
right.
people forget about that. Like,
Yep.
they were on a mainstream label for years. Like they kind of worked outside of the church world for a lot of years.
Right.
And uh, same thing. Like they did have some success because of MTV, right? And they got into people's homes, but still like that mega level, that kind of that mega level kind of eluded them. It never got just never got there.
Where do you
So,
think King's X falls into all this?
oh man, that was my favorite band.
Yep.
Well, it was a favorite band at a point in my life where I really connect, like musically, I really connected with them. Like when
Yeah.
it was something about seeing them in a club at a young age,
Right.
because there were rumors they were a Christian band at the time, and their records were weird.
They
Man, their
were.
first three records just crazy, but they were in Drop D, first band I ever heard in Drop D.
Yep.
Soundgarden has gone on to say they were influenced by like that first King's X record. Pearl
Record.
Jam
Yep.
has
Hmm.
gone on record to say that they were influenced by that early King's X stuff. And for y'all that don't know, um, if you Google the band King's X, um, you can go on YouTube. There's a couple of really cool videos there. They kind of look dated, but pretty much they're a three piece that they just sound huge.
Yeah,
Just
it would rock
I
your face off when you saw them
it was
live.
they just sounded huge, but when I saw them live, it kinda changed my trajectory of,
Right.
like, of music. Like, I was like, "Oh my gosh, this was it was just they were just so good. They sounded so unique. So, but they were a band that had some rumors they were Christians. They used to be a backup band for a band called Morgan Cryer, right?
Right.
Which was a Christian artist, and they were playing for Phil Keaggy, right?
Yep.
So they were in that world, touring in that world, and when they started King's X, they wanted that to be completely mainstream, right?
Right.
And so there were rumors they were Christians. Of course, they put out some incredible records. All their records had themes, back in the day. It was really creative. And then in the 90s, they did a record with super famous producer Brendan O'Brien.
O'Brien.
So
Yep.
Brendan O'Brien's responsible for Pearl Jam. He
Hmm.
did the Soundgarden stuff. He did
Right.
all the Stone Temple Pilot stuff. He did so many. I mean, I don't know at this point how many. I mean, that dude has won so many Grammys. It's
Yeah.
been crazy.
Right.
But he did a record for King's X and completely changed their sound. Right, like they kind of went from like this kind of weird, creative thing to more just of a grungier, drier, dirty tone.
Right.
And that was their biggest point right there.
Right.
Like I think their label was going to push them. They played Woodstock that year. They headlined, didn't they headline Woodstock
Yeah, I
or
believe they did.
something crazy? Like Woodstock was huge. This was in the 90s when they brought it back, and they had that was the big push. Brendan O'Brien produced that record. Atlantic was going to put a big jump, push into them, and it just never really happened. I think I saw them open up for ACDC that tour. I think, and got to see him in a club. But they just again really never got that push because I think the record after that was the last record they did for. They were on Atlantic Records,
Right.
in I think they did it in Nashville, and it was they just started. You can tell they were just they just toured for their people, like
They
for their
did.
fans. That
Right.
was it. Like they were
Right.
like, we're good with this, and they're still around, still
Yeah,
doing it.
they are. And as you
Yeah.
mentioned, man, just the number of like peep artists, Christian and secular, if you want to split them up like that, I mean, that they influenced, it's
Well, it's
insane.
in I will say this, in musician circles, like they were always the more respected
Yeah,
band, right? I
absolutely.
think if like that's how you knew if somebody was just like a legit like music fan, like musician.
Right.
Most everybody would tell you that King's X was just like that was just next level, you
Right.
know, and but that was like they were always like the musicians band,
Right.
always like
Right.
that was always their thing. But man, they just never could hit that huge mainstream thing. But you know what, man, I don't know if it was just my taste, but I was just never drawn to anything that was hugely mainstream ever.
Yeah.
Like it's changed over the years. We've been to see U2, we've been to see
Right.
Coldplay, we've been to
Right.
see John Mayer.
Right.
I've those are by far the biggest bands I've ever seen live. I'm just really happy, going to see Striper at a small club in Charlotte.
Right. Right.
Like I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. But although John Mayer last year was pretty magical. You know,
Yeah, I bet that was. I
yeah,
haven't had a chance to see him, but I've just talking to you, I've heard it's an absolutely amazing show. So,
yeah, it's kind of nuts. Like his band is like the band of all bands. And
yeah.
it's not just like a four piece. He's got like
Right.
two keys players, three guitar players,
Right.
background singers, drummer, percussionist, and Pino on bass. And it's just like, my gosh, man, they just
Right.
sounded. It's just again, PA technology, live technology with sound quality is just awesome. It's
Right.
awesome to watch.
Let's talk about one other kind of topic within this this whole kind of looking back on the 90s and comparing it to the way it is today. When you and I were traveling, there were no cell phones. There was no social media. We
Yeah.
mentioned, you mentioned that a little bit a minute ago, but we really, we kept ourselves busy on the road by playing the Nintendo that we had
Yes, we did.
wired in our van. What do you think has been some of the biggest change for the touring band over the last 25 to 30 years?
Well, the touring industry is I mean, back then, you remember how long bands toured? Like, they would
Oh
tour
yeah,
for a year.
I mean, they
Like,
would.
yeah, they
It
would
was
tour for
insane.
years. Yes, like, it was they would tour all the time. So, nowadays, that those even John Mayer does shorter runs. If you go and really pay attention to his tours,
Right,
you've got bands, certain bands, like, I'm not knocking Nickelback. I don't
right,
wanna jump on that stereotype.
right,
Uh, bless them. But, like, there's a market they know they do well in, right?
right,
And so they're just gonna tour that market. That's it. So they're not gonna tour any other market. You're not gonna see them going into, like, that style of music is much bigger, like, in the Southwest, Midwest area. Uh, Very rarely are we gonna ever in fact, I don't even know if they've been in my area in the last 5 years, right? It's kind of interesting how touring has become that way. Like, there's just certain promoters that bring in certain bands when it used to be they would bring in anything. It didn't matter what it was, And in Christian music, um, churches hosted a lot of concerts, like
right.
a ton of concerts. Like, they
Yeah,
were the ones that supported, like, the whole industry for a long time.
right,
Growing up here, like, it was just a handful of churches that would bring in Mylon
right.
Lefebvre, like an OG worship guy. They
Yep,
would do all that, but
right,
um, all of that is done. Elevation brings in people for the summer for, like, their youth, Elevation Youth.
hmm,
They call it Rhythm, but they bring in some people, but that is more hip hop, like Lecrae
right,
kind of stuff, right? Like
right,
rap. But
right,
they're not bringing in any Christian heavy bands. That
right,
none of that doesn't. It just doesn't happen. You know.
right.
So yeah, torn industry is very different, man. I will say this. So the people I've talked to the last couple of years, I have a friend of mine that developed, like, a software platform for bands, basically, that handles their merch, their tour
Oh,
tickets,
cool.
manages everything from, like, uh, an app on your phone, right?
Wow.
And it will know, like, if you're, for example, if you sold a lot of medium size, black hoodies. Once you get down to a certain number, it automatically orders
Oh, wow.
your hoodies to you.
Oh,
Like,
that's
you don't even
awesome.
have to wait for somebody to send you your merch anymore, and you can handle ticket prices and haggling everything over an app, like how the splits are. I will say that's kind of cool because
Yeah,
we
that is
never had
cool.
that. We
No.
never had that.
Mm,
And even during the years when I toured where, we were doing pretty well, um, I think I always thought, like, man, what are we missing out on? You know,
right,
and but so in a way, the technology's gotten better. I think with touring and the way you can manage your merchandise and all that good stuff. But otherwise, I think it's a lot less. I know it's a lot less.
right,
There's just not bands doing it as much as what we were used to. You know.
right, right. All right, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about technology. For as long as I've known you, you've been a gear and tech nerd, and you proudly wear that hat.
Oh, I love it.
You've
Yeah.
always been ahead of the curve when it comes to technology, and you have the ability to really understand it in ways that most people, including myself, just simply can't. Speak for a bit on how technology has changed since you first started, especially. I mean, I know you talked about what it was like in the early days. Talk about what it's like now and that
Oh, wow.
transition and just
So
everything that goes into that.
so on a big level, right? On a big level, things have become very, um, like, mostly things are done remotely. For
Right,
example, like how we're doing this podcast, we're in two
right,
different locations.
right,
So recording has become very much that way.
right,
Like, I just finished up a project where the drummer did his parts, like in another state. The bass player did his parts in another state. The guitar player came down here, did his guitar parts here. We did the vocals here, and boom, record's done. Right.
right,
And that has been probably the biggest change in technology, is the ability to work remotely, and the equipment to do it. So, because it existed, but it just wasn't as easy to learn. right? I had to learn
Right.
the software. The main studio software is Pro Tools, right?
Right.
I didn't have YouTube to tell me how to use it. I had to just learn it. Nowadays, you can jump on YouTube, be like, "Hey, how do I get an auto tune effect in GarageBand?"
Right.
3 minutes later, you got it, right? Or how to do whatever, and music has just technology has just pushed things forward in music, and it's one of those things that I either have to learn it because I have to stay ahead of it,
Right.
because bottom line is, in this industry, excuse me, I had to, um, I have to know how to edit vocals. Like, I
Right.
have to know how to tune vocals. Do I agree with tuning vocals all the time? Not really, but the fact is, like, when songs started coming out tuned and everybody was, they're listening to these songs tuned, they'll go back and listen to a song that's not tuned to be like, "Hey, that sounds weird.
Right.
Why does it sound weird?" They don't know why, right? They don't know why it sounds strange. The fact is, tuned vocals is got to happen, right?
Right.
It's like with drumming. Rick Beato, very famous YouTuber, has like kind of a strong an opinion about editing drums, right? Like he's just like, well, it made it just made things lifeless. He's a big fan of like older music. I can understand that. I get it. All good. But the fact is, and we have a generation of musicians that have grown up playing to a click track now,
Right.
mostly because of church, right?
Right.
Back then musicians grew up either playing in a club, right? They would go play clubs, um, and honestly, not the best place to get your chops up, but you were playing, right? But
Right.
then when churches became the hot spot for musicians, now we have a generation of musicians that can play to a click track. Some of them are creative, not very, you see it, both ways, but the bottom line is like music has just naturally gotten more uh stringent is the word I would use, or starchy, stiff,
Right.
you know
Right. Right.
and that, good or bad, it's no opinion. But the bottom line is, when I produce a record for somebody, and there's like, "Hey, Rick, we're kind of going for," they can name any influence. I don't care what it is. Um, it's tuned, right? Those vocals are
Right.
tuned, right? We're going to tune those vocals, and we're going to make sure things are quantized is the word that we use for stuff. But yeah, technology wise, I had to learn it because it was just a part of our industry. And I would hear like Melodyne is the big software for vocals. I thank God I had a friend of mine. He was like, "Man, I know this dude he's using Melodyne," because I hated autotune at the time. So I tried
Right.
Melodyne and fell in love with it. But I had
Right.
to learn it just like everything else, right?
Right.
And now it's like, you know, most mornings I'm in here early, usually around 7-ish a.m. I'll get some coffee, and it's boring to listen to. Oh my gosh. It's not great to sit here and listen to me edit things, but it's a fact of life.
Right.
It's no different than editing a video
Right.
or editing a photo, right?
Right.
Except in this case, we're kind of doing it with audio. So, but back to technology, we've seen, the company that has driven that has been Apple,
Yeah.
ultimately, in the music
Right.
scene. Always. It's always been Apple. I don't care what anybody says. Now, Apple has made some missteps with professional computers over the years. Do you remember that trash can cylinder they put out
Yeah.
years ago? I just call it
Right.
the trash can.
Right.
It was literally a trash can. I hated it.
Right. Yeah.
Like, but they always tried different design stuff, and some of it was not great, and then some of it was great. But honestly, where we are now in technology, right? The reality is this: I am using currently a Mac Pro from 2019. I think this was a $14,000 Mac Pro. Okay,
Wow.
you can order a Mac Mini M2, which is Apple's own silicone processor that benchmarks higher than my $14,000 Mac Pro I'm using right now for $599.
Gee whiz.
There you go.
Yeah. That's
So
crazy.
That's that's where we are. Like, that's what happens. Like,
Right.
there's been a leap because Apple was like, "Hey, we're gonna make our own processors, right? And we can make them, and we can keep the price of this computer at $600 or $500, and you get something as powerful as what our $14,000 Mac Pro was in 2019." That's where we are. Like,
Right.
that's the reality of the situation. Now, I don't think we'll see another jump with power like that for about 10 years,
Mm.
because Apple kind of, what people don't realize is it's nothing new. Windows, Microsoft, they've been trying to do it for years. It's just Apple has created an ecosystem, that ecosystem that I can use my messages on my computer right now while I'm talking to you. Everything's on there, and they made this processor that's so strong, it works with everything. And now you can, like, I can mix an entire record, master it on the same session on a $500 machine, right? Not a
Gosh.
$14,000 machine.
Right.
So,
That is
um,
crazy.
yeah, man. So that's kind of the reality. Like, that's where we are technology wise. That's why I say, like, when people call me, "Hey, man, like, what's the best like recording thing or I can get or just something to work on?" I'm like, "You got GarageBand
Right.
in your laptop or your iPad or your phone."
Right.
I have bands. I have bands that we do pre-production on records. Pre-production, basically, they just record demos of the song, and I kind of listen
Right.
to them and just give them feedback.
Right.
Hey, try this for the chorus, try this for the bridge, whatever. Um, they're recording them on like iPads.
Right.
you know, like,
Right.
it's just crazy. It's like, hey, how did you record this? Oh, I did this on an iPad Mini. I'm like, wow,
Right.
okay, and it sounds good.
Right.
But that's kind of where we are with recording and software wise. Like, I mentioned Pro Tools, but Logic, Ableton in the church world is the big one. Ableton
Right.
Live is the ability. So if a worship leader shows up one morning, he's like, "Hey, man, I don't want to sing this song in A. Let's drop it down to G." Right? You can go into Ableton and hit two buttons and boop boop boop, and then all
Right.
the tracks are in the key of G. You know,
Right.
Hopefully, the band can play in the key of G, and you're good to go.
Right.
That technology did not exist
No.
15 years ago.
No, it
Like,
didn't.
and now, does it sound perfect when it does it? Not really, but live, it kind of just works, right?
Right.
But that's kind of where we are. In the future for music, which is kind of, you're already seeing with mastering, is AI mastering,
Right.
right?
Right.
So there's a company called Isotope, which they make some incredible, like, I use them for my mastering. I think they make the best mastering tools for me anyway. But they have a set of plugins that will analyze a track for you and tell you, hey, it seems like the low end needs to be turned down and it needs to be compressed here. Like, it kind of just tells you what you need for that track,
Wow.
right? You don't need ear training to, like back in the day with us, we had to like listen to it.
Oh yeah.
Our ears had to process it, and we had
Right.
to know frequency, like what frequency had to be turned down, right?
Right.
So nowadays, with that kind of software, we know. I mean, I can visually look at a sound source with a plugin and tell you if there's going to be an issue without listening to it. It's kind of weird, but
That is weird.
that is kind of where we are. Like, things have been, we're kind of headed that direction, and it's okay. Like, you know, I don't want to get into the whole AI thing, but the fact is it's not going to go anywhere.
No.
Like, it's already kind of, it's been functioning already in the background with our habits on the internet, or your shopping habits, or how you decide to engage with social media, right?
Right. I've even started using. There's a it's called Chat GPA. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's AI built, and I basically use it to generate show notes and discussion topics a lot of times for some of the podcasts I do.
It's
And I
incredible.
literally just type in, you know, basically tell it to give me um, SEO optimized show notes for or
Wow.
SEO optimized keywords for a topic on such and such, and it just automatically gives me these things that I can input into my SEO. I mean, it's crazy. It's
I have
absolutely crazy.
a friend of mine. He's one of my contracted engineers that helps me here.
Right.
Um, he'll him he's songwriting with some people, and they'll use the AI to
Right.
kind of write. They're like, hey, we want to write a country song about a tractor, blah blah blah, and it like spits it out.
Right.
I'm
Right.
like, holy
Yeah,
macaroni,
it's
man.
that's kind of how I'm using it just from a podcast standpoint. But yeah, it's crazy, man. But how hard is it to adapt to all these changes and stay up to date on everything? I mean,
I'll
is it
tell you
like you
this.
figure out one thing and then all of a sudden it's changing to something else? I mean, is that or is it stay
I
pretty
I
consistent?
I personally feel this is what I feel. I feel like there was a change. Like I did have to adjust maybe in the early 2000s
Right.
to recording workflows, and that was hard. Like when things went from more of a traditional way of recording to a computer,
Right.
and then the world of editing opened up where I can copy and paste a chorus vocal from the first chorus to the second chorus. That opened up a whole
Oh
different
yeah.
world,
Yeah.
right? And man, what does it say? They say like 10,000 hours into something before you master
You
it. I
become an
think it,
expert or a
yeah,
master. Yeah.
and very much it was very much that. I would say up until 5 years ago, not that I've figured everything out. I have not figured everything out,
Right.
but I felt like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I had run across every issue, like every problem.
Right.
Like, and I kind of figured it out. I was like, oh, okay, and so I don't feel like I have any kind of like when you throw something new in front of me, like I feel like the learning curve is getting less, right? It's gotten less for me over the years, but like a good example is I'm a big fan of video games.
Right.
That's really when I'm outside of the studio. If I'm not hanging out with my wife and the dogs, or I like to cook and chill, we'll watch some shows. But I love video games. Big fan of the PS5 and PC gaming. There's a game called Destiny 2 I just love. That's like
Right.
kind of like just I can turn off my brain and just play.
Right.
And games nowadays are live services. In other words, Fortnite has 4 seasons a year. They change every season. Things change in the game, right? They change how weapons work. They change so much, and they do it to make the game feel fresh,
Right.
right? That's how they keep people coming back. Destiny does the same thing, and I feel like culture wise, that's kind of what we're running into. Like our phones, right? Like when the new iOS update happens, I used to not let my phone update because it was a pain for like
Right.
a month because I had
Right.
to like learn, you know,
Right.
what they change. The fact is, it's like embedded into us now. Like
Yeah.
we are going to have a new iPhone operating system, pretty much whether we like it or not, and they're going to
Right.
move stuff around, and we're going to have to
Right.
figure that out.
Right.
So, but I would say that as far as learning the technology of things, I have some really good friends in the industry that if I have to lean on them for certain things, I'll hit them up and be like, "Hey, man, like recently, the last couple of years, Dante is what it's called. It's kind of a protocol for audio. Um, not to get too technical, but it's basically looks like an Ethernet cable, right? You would
Okay.
use to plug in for your modem at home.
Right.
They're using that to move audio now, essentially,
Wow.
like a version of that, right? And what it allows you to do is take 64, it doesn't matter how many channels of audio with one cable, and you can move it multiple places within one building and just do amazing things, right? It's very expensive to do it, but the fact that we're at that point,
Right.
you know, it's kind of I had to legitimately look it up and see if it was an option for my studio. Right? Wait,
Right.
do I need to be jumping on Dante in my studio? I don't.
Right. Right.
I don't need to move 128 input lines, all over the
Right.
place. Now, if I build a multi-room studio, yes, I would absolutely look at that because think about it. Instead of 128 different cables, I have one, right?
Right.
And it's kind of crazy how that works. But no, man, I like technology. I've embraced it. I feel like it's slowed down a lot over the years. I don't feel, I feel Apple. they're never going to hit a saturation point because they're very smart about their products. But
Right.
if they innovate, things kind of follow, and music kind of follows when they innovate,
Right.
right? In the Windows world, I'm not anti Windows at all. They've gotten a lot better over the years with the manufacturers. My beef was always I always felt like my MacBook Pro was very good quality, right? Like it just felt like a good laptop, and you wouldn't see that in the PC world until maybe Dell started jumping into that price range. Now,
Right.
now they have almost identical products at different price ranges, right? So, but technology wise, like I just feel like things have slowed down a little bit. We're in the golden age though of like if you're a guitar player, man, the technology available now is incredible. Like
Is
it's
there
just
anything coming, any up and coming advances in technology? I mean, we've talked about AI, we've talked about, some of the other things but anything that you haven't mentioned that you're excited
well,
about, or
I'm
is there anything that's
I'm
coming that you're not
I'm
excited about?
I hate VR. I'm
Yeah, I
not
don't know.
excited about
I'm not
VR.
excited
Like
about that
I
either.
don't I think Facebook putting all of their eggs in the VR meta
Yeah,
basket is
meta
the
stuff.
dumbest
Yeah,
thing I've heard.
I know. I
Dumb.
agree.
Like I tried the Quest 2, right? I think is that what it was called?
I think so.
I
Yeah.
can't remember. It was a VR thing. I'm a
Right.
gamer. Again, I wanted to try it. And it just does not work for me. It actually made me very sick, right?
Yeah.
It was kind of
Right.
crazy what it did for me. But Apple supposedly has their version coming out this year, and it's supposed to be very expensive at first, and it's going to get
Right.
cheaper. Like
Right.
now, I'm wondering, like, okay, how are I am interested to see how Apple is going to implement VR because they're always going to do their own thing, but I don't think VR is going to be as popular as people said it was going to be. In fact, it's not. What I do think is maybe AR, which is kind of where you can still wear like normal glasses,
Right.
see the real world, and then see
Right.
things in it. So you may
Right.
be able, you can have a normal pair of glasses, normal, that may be able to like show you maps, right? Or maybe messages or whatever. There's a lot of things we could see with that, but I think that's going to be the next step. It's just going to have to be better than what it is now. You know.
Have you heard any of the talk about being able to, put on the VR stuff and be able to go instantly into a live concert?
Yes.
That's crazy.
Fortnite's been doing that, right?
Yeah.
They've been
Okay.
hosting live concerts
See, I don't know
now.
anything about this
Yeah.
stuff, so you're really
So
educating me on what's
Fortnite
going on with
started
it.
doing, I don't, have you ever heard of Ninja? He's a dude. He's got usually dyed blue hair, but
No, I don't think so.
he got famous. He got super famous on Twitch streaming. Twitch video game streaming,
Gotcha.
which another platform I love. I love watching people play video games. I never thought that I would ever publicly say that, but I legit like watching people play video games
Right.
on Twitch. It's really fun. But he got famous for playing, I think, with Drake. I
Mm,
think popular hip hop artist on
right.
Fortnite, and his Ninja's career kind of blew up from there, and now I think he's got an Adidas deal. He's got a deal, like he's a huge Detroit Lions fan. Like he does stuff with the NFL now. Uh, have you ever heard of Doctor Disrespect? He's like a this is I'll send you a link, but this dude like
Okay.
dresses up like he's from the '80s. Like has a
Oh wow.
fake mullet wig, right? Wears like these glasses, and he's a character, and he's funny. He's cocky. He's just the best of the best. If the number is 1,000 streamers, he's like, I have 100 million streamers in my chat. Like everything is like, but he's funny, but he's an entertainer, and he's another big one.
Right.
You're talking to people that, you know, on average can have up to like 40 or 50,000 people watching them a day,
That's crazy.
right? So, but VR, going back to VR and technology, I think we'll see things slow down with processing power
Right.
because Apple kind of made a big leap, and now we're going to see incremental changes, but it's not going to be anything crazy. I think they're just setting up for VR, whatever their version of VR. Kind of disappointed they haven't put out a car. Like
Yeah.
that was a rumor. Like
Yeah. I remember hearing about that.
and like car technology is kind of very interesting to me because I think we will see the changeover to electric in our generation.
Yeah.
I
I
think
agree.
that's eventually going to happen. Like I've had a hybrid the last two vehicles, right? But struggled finding a car that I thought, okay, or a vehicle that I just didn't want to spend. Like I have a kid in college, like I
Right.
can't spend 70 grand on a
Right.
Rivian truck. Although
Right.
that is what I want. It's called a Rivian, and it's beautiful. Like it does. It's an incredible vehicle, but
Mhm.
like that's where I do see things changing for us, like power at home, solar power at home, things like that. We'll see some changes with that, but technology wise, man, like I mean, everything's just kind of moved to our phones, man. We went to Iceland in December. That whole trip was like every ticket I bought, everything Apple Wallet.
Oh,
That
wow.
was it.
Yeah.
Everything. I didn't. I brought my debit cards. I didn't even use my debit cards.
Wow.
Just used Apple Pay for
Yeah.
everything
That's
in a
crazy.
foreign country. It was nuts,
Yeah,
you
it
know?
is.
So, but that stuff I love. That stuff I love. But I don't know. I don't think streaming's going away. I think the pandemic kind of, and
Yeah.
some things that kind of made that okay, right?
Right. Right.
And people, we've watched a lot of companies kind of struggle with people going back to workplace. I personally think people would be healthier together,
Yeah.
right? I do feel that way. I know
I
I'm a
agree.
person that loves having people around,
Right.
but there are times where remote works, right? And
Yeah.
it makes sense, you know.
Yeah.
And I think in that way, it's made the world a lot smaller. But musically and technology wise, I do think we're seeing some small movements. Most of the movement we're seeing is with software.
Right.
Software's getting easier, more accessible. The whole thing of free, I say that in quotations because nothing's really ever free, right? Like it's just
Right.
not. But we are seeing some pretty cool movement with that, But can you imagine, like, when you get a Tesla nowadays, you have to pay for like certain upgrades.
Right.
That's the way it's going to be.
Right. Yeah.
You'll buy a car. Hey, do you want the eighth cylinder? Like, do you want to feel like, instead of feeling like a four cylinder, we'll double the engine power for $2,500.
Right.
Like,
Right.
that's what it's going to be.
Exactly. Yep.
That's exactly what's gonna happen. Like,
Right.
we'll have that at some point, with our vehicles and maybe even our homes.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely see it getting there. Yeah. How long? Who knows? But I definitely see it getting there too. Well, man, as I mentioned also at the top of the podcast, at the top of the episode, you're also a husband. You're a
Oh yeah,
father to two adult children now, which does not
yeah.
seem real. It just
It
does not
doesn't.
seem real. You stay booked up in the studio, like you mentioned. You stay very busy with that. You mentioned also that you're a contract musician for
Yeah.
at Elevation.
Elevation. Yep.
I mean, you stay very active, very busy. How have you managed the whole work life balance over the years?
Well, I'm personally, I think I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I don't want to say I got burned out, but I realized I needed to start taking time off. Right.
Right,
So, number one, first thing, Mondays are like my chill day. Right.
right,
I either choose to work or not.
right,
And honestly, it's like 50-50.
right,
If there's stuff I need to do, I'll jump into the studio real fast and get files sent out or something or follow up on something. But for the most part, Mondays are for like getting groceries, right? I grilled out, used a Traeger last night, made some baby
mhm.
back ribs, chilled out
Oh,
with
wow.
Tyson. We watched. We're really into The Last of Us right now.
Mhm.
Have you been watching that show?
I haven't. I've heard good stuff about it, but
Holy
I haven't watched
macaroni!
it.
It
I
was a
don't
great
watch a
video
lot of
game.
TV anymore.
Gosh,
I've kinda gotten more into, like, reading. I just read all the time, it
I
seems
love
like.
reading. I
Yeah,
love reading, but that's a good video game, number one, and the show
yeah,
on HBO Max has been stellar. They've done a great job. But we'll watch the show, and then, but going back to raising the kids and doing this, it was, man. When I think about it now, it was kind of crazy. So, but we were just very involved with our kids. My wife's a teacher, so we kind of had the kids wherever Tyson taught, right? And that helped. And then just kind of being Mr. Mom. I was the one that ended up taking the kids to school most of the
right,
time. In fact, like for the last 6 or 7 years, I took them every day, picked them up and coached soccer, coached football, coached sports I did not know anything about. like kind of just it was important to me that we did that with them.
Right.
um and just being a musician, I know it was different for my kids, and my kids really didn't realize it until they got older and their friend group expanded. Like when my daughter went to college and started meeting like other friends, like their parents were doctors or
Right.
whatever. And she's just like, "Hey, Dad, like, kind of weird to explain to people what you do."
Right.
And but the fact is, it's just I it's part of the music culture has changed over the years, but I think being available for my family and working from home was a very positive thing. And
Right.
my wife had some health issues, after our son was born.
Right.
She was diagnosed with cancer, right?
Right.
And that was a 10-year road
Yeah.
of a lot of visits, chemo, treatments, surgeries, just it was a whole thing. It was a
Right.
whole thing. And I think that just kind of like not that my perspective was wrong, but it definitely tweaked my perspective because as believers, and this is something I personally struggle with because we have a friend that's an incredible preacher, Clayton King,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like Clayton is just a master communicator,
He
right?
is. Yeah.
He is so good at what he does. And but sometimes when you watch a guy preach like that, you're like, maybe, I can do that, or I'm going to be the guy that changes the world. No, that's not me.
Right.
Like
Right.
and think, and it's not all of us, right? And I
Right.
think at the core level as a believer, we need to be good husbands,
Right.
good fathers,
Right.
good friends. And I'm not
Right.
saying good as in, be a good guy, like be real,
Right.
like there and were there tough times for our family? Absolutely. Yes, and we walked through a lot of really tough things, and the churches we were with really did help us in having a community of friends. That's something we've learned as a family, something me and Tyson, my wife, have learned. Like, we've been very careful of who we let into our friendship group,
Right.
right?
That's wise.
And yeah, and it's been, we have lifelong friends, man, that have just moved all over the country, and we still keep up with them, and we try very hard to connect with them and travel, but the fact is that core, like being a good husband, father, the community, right? I remember kind of feeling guilty that most of my clientele was not local. At one time here in the studio, I was doing more outside of North Carolina work,
Right.
and I wanted to change that. Really, I not that that was a perception, but there may have been a perception. Oh, Ricky's like the Christian guy doing Christian music or doing rock stuff.
Right.
Nothing wrong with that, but I think it did, you know, maybe put out something that he only does this, and I kind of had to like let people know, no, 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 no. Like if you're doing country music, let's do it.
Right.
As long as the content's reasonable, I'm good with
Right.
that.
Right.
But you know, and the root of country music goes back to gospel.
Oh
It
yeah.
all goes back to gospel.
Yeah. It
Every
does.
bit of it. All of it. All of it. All of the musicians we've loved dating back to the 20s and 30s all played at church at some level.
Right. Hmm.
It's where all music kind of it's why we have Elvis, you know.
Right.
It just kind of worked, but it but at the same time, when it comes to like family and man, it's just I couldn't do what I do without my wife's support
Right.
ever, or even the kids' support. Now that I have adult kids and they're like getting health insurance at jobs,
Right.
like walking them through like rent payments and
Right.
like the cost of living and budgets, and like something important for us with our kids was number one, uh, listening, not judging, and kind of just walking with them through some tough situations,
Right.
and just making ourselves available. It's hard as a parent not to say your opinion, and I can get very opinion about and very opinionated about things, and but at the bottom line is there's going to be conflict. You're going to have to learn how to deal with that conflict
Right.
and love them regardless,
Right.
and that goes for really everybody, but especially
Right.
for family because they know you the most. You
Right.
know, my wife knows that when I get home from church on Sunday, as much as I love it, I'm dead. I want to sleep for
Right.
an hour and a half, and then we
Right.
go to B Dubs and eat ice cream and have
Right.
burgers, and that's it. The rest of the week, I can't eat carbs,
Right.
but
Right.
like, but that's our thing, So, but when it comes to like being a musician and juggling life, you know, my phone is. I mean, I respond to people all day, even at
Right.
night, middle
Right.
of the night. If I wake up and I see something, I'll respond. And I try to be very good about that. It's kind of hard, man, but um, especially now when people message you on Instagram, Facebook, it's wild.
Right.
Discord,
There's so many
Discord's
different.
become a big part of what I do now,
Right.
which is a great platform in itself.
Right.
But when it comes to family, I would always encourage people to find a friend group that encourages you, right? And where you're growing, and you would know if you're not growing or not. But man, I know I'm super thankful for my family, and we've really, even with my dad, which is, over the years, our relationship is stronger than ever. Me and him don't always agree on things, right?
Right.
Like we just like spiritually anyway, or even politically sometimes.
Right.
But it's okay. Like I'm fine with that. You know,
Right.
I just, I can't expect him to see what the way I see it. But I have to respect him, right? And what he's walked through, when you leave a country that they took everything from you, that really changes your
It
outlook
does. It
with
does. Yeah.
politics, right? And but again, we're in a man like my kids were on the early side of social media, and it scared me to death. Like
Right.
I instantly saw like the car wrecks,
Right.
like the potential car wrecks, right? The train
Right.
wrecks,
Right.
and we had to have some wild conversations about that, like at what level we wanted them to use social media and what it's become, and even their behavior on it. And um, my biggest pet peeve, man, like people can portray one thing in social media and be the exact opposite in real life. And something
Exactly.
I've always challenged my kids and my family is we are who we are.
Right.
Like period, good or bad, and just be careful with that.
And man, as long as I've known you, that's one thing I can say with beyond a shadow of a doubt is what you see with Ricky Rodriguez is what you get. You don't put on a front. You're as real as they come, and that's one
I
of the things
appreciate
I've
that,
always respected about you, man. Is
man. I you know I've been my role as a mentor over the last 10 years has really taught me um to man to have a lot of grace,
right,
man. Like God has given us so much grace, and I can be the hardest on myself
right,
about things. I really can.
right,
And man, I find sometimes I'm pretty comfortable. I'm very comfortable with conflict. Like
right.
I'm okay. I'm okay with it.
Yeah,
Like all right, let's figure this out, right? And it's just something that kind of just had to learn how to do. But even in the church world, it happens. I mean, it happens. It happens anywhere. It's just as believers, we need to walk. We need to talk uh, above that.
right.
Our actions really need to really be above board. I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, I absolutely
And
agree.
it's just and it's I can't impart that standard on everybody, but I can live it as an
Right,
example.
absolutely.
And I can't preach like Clayton. It's just not going to happen.
Right,
But I can be who I am.
exactly.
And influence that way.
Right, exactly. Well, man, what's coming up for you? Anything exciting on the horizon?
Yes. Well, I'm always working on records, so it's kind of
Right,
crazy. Like stuff that's coming out this year, I worked on like the past year, right?
right,
So there are some good things coming up. I mentioned Yogi earlier. There's a band
right.
called World Gone Cold. Look
Mhm.
that up. So you're
Amazing.
talking the drummer
So
from
good.
Demon Hunter, bass player from POD, guitar player
Yep,
from Disciple, another guitar player from the Letter Black. Great band, and
yep.
got to know those guys really well over this past year. And I think they're doing their first show. I think in April in Florida. I think.
Yeah.
I think Yogi. I don't even know if I should say this, but he may or may not be playing drums for POD that day.
Oh, sweet. Yeah,
So
I talk to Yoga on occasion, but
yeah,
yeah, that would be
yeah.
awesome. That'd be
So
sweet.
that's kind of killer. So
Yeah, it is.
that's like legitimately killer. But so that record, those singles have already dropped. They've started dropping and they're doing really great. So super excited about that stuff. And then um, man, I've got some artists that like we're talking local artists that are hitting multi-million streams,
Right.
on singles and songs, and I just love that stuff. We just finished a local band, Sycamore Bones here,
Mm,
which was really fun. Like they're very plugged in locally. They're great guys, great band, and it was just a good example of a local band that just needed some help. Right,
right.
they just needed some
Right.
production help. I
Right.
didn't change anything. I didn't do anything crazy. Just kind of steered them certain directions, and that record is doing great. I think they're doing
Awesome.
some fundraising for that. So, but um, man, there's always fun stuff. Working on a single for Soma Church
Yeah.
for Easter.
Yeah.
So those guys were in the studio. Their Nolan was in here. He's half our age.
Yeah. I
Very
know.
talented,
Great guy though.
right?
Great guy.
Like, but that's a good example, right? Like
Yeah.
we're I'm at the point now that hey, those guys need to do this stuff. I don't
Right.
need to play on everybody's record,
Right.
and that's fine. I still play on a lot of people's records.
Yeah.
Play a lot of guitar, but um, it's kind of fun to watch that generation really create and do some really good, unique music, right? And it's fun that it's a what I would consider a local church doing such good things, like
Right.
creatively, musically.
Right. Yep.
So,
Absolutely.
but no, man, just the normal stuff, man. I honestly, that's it. Like, I did pick up some new guitar gear, so I'm always into that. So,
No, not you.
I'm doing a video shoot for Elliott Guitars soon.
Are you?
So,
Cool.
yeah, I'm doing. If that's another one that I've partnered with over the last couple of years. Those guitar builders, they're just incredible.
Right.
In made in North Carolina, good. They're just. Oh, I love his guitars, man. They're
Right.
just
Yeah.
fantastic. So,
They are.
but other than that, that's it, man. I'm pretty much here. Uh, maybe getting into the podcast world later this year if I can find the time. I miss doing this. I love
Yeah, you
doing this,
should. Yeah. I
but
love
it's just
back when you had your football podcast that you
it's
did.
fun. It's
I
fun,
loved it.
but
It was
I
great.
kind of want to bring it back, kind of steer it back towards the Western North Carolina thing,
Right.
bringing in
Right.
business owners and
Right.
musicians, and kind of
Yeah,
just
it'd be
keeping it that
sweet.
way. But it's my favorite platform, right? I
Right.
think podcasts. Like my wife is at home every night listening to what is it, true crime. That's
Yeah.
like the big, like she, it's hilarious to me that she just loves that stuff so much. It's great. It's awesome, but that's
Right.
what she's into.
Yeah.
And it's like, I just think as a platform, it's just fantastic,
Yeah.
and
It
it's very
absolutely is.
accessible.
Yep. Definitely. So, where
All
can
right, bro.
people find you if they're interested in connecting with you?
So three places. Instagram, I'm at Ricky Rod, right? On Instagram. And then I just have a website, bombhouserecording.com. All my social links are there. And then Bombhouse Recording on Facebook. You can pretty much hit me on any of those platforms.
Right.
And that's it. So if you reach out to me and I don't respond immediately, it may take me a couple of days or weeks. It just
Right.
depends on what my schedule is. But I kind of what I kind of do nowadays is if I don't know who you are, um, I definitely like to at least talk first and make sure it's a good fit kind of a
Right.
thing,
Right.
and then we kind of move forward. And then in a lot of my work is referenced, and if you know somebody that I worked on their record, just let me know that.
Yeah.
So, but for the most part, yeah, man, rocking and rolling, like still at it, like let's go, not slowing
Sweet.
down.
Yep. Well, man, before we wind it up today, I want to do something to kind of wind up this, kind of wind things down. Bringing back a segment. I've done this several times before, but I thought I'd bring it back for you because I thought we'd have fun with it. But I'm going to ask you 5 questions real quick, and as fast as you can, give me the first answer that pops in your head. All
All
right.
right. I'm gonna
All
try
right.
not
You
to
ready?
miss.
Here
All
we
right, no
go.
cussing.
Who is your early pick to win the Super Bowl next year?
Oh my gosh. I mean, this is easy. Chiefs.
Chiefs? You think
Yeah.
so? You
Oh
think
yeah.
they'll do
Oh yeah.
it?
I think
Sweet.
in the NFL, if you have a top 5 quarterback, you always
Yeah.
have a chance. And if
Yeah.
Mahomes is quarterbacking that team and he's healthy, they'll absolutely be in the race again.
I agree.
Unless
Cool.
Tua.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. All
All
right.
right.
Number two, if you could only keep one Christian album from the 90s, what would it be?
Oh my gosh. From the 90s?
From the 90s.
Oh. Oh my gosh. I have to Google this. Hold on. Hold on. I so it's gonna have to 90s Christian bands, Christian rock bands. It man, it's I can already kind of tell you. Um, but I'm gonna look just in case. Hold on, hold on, hold on. From the 90s.
Yep.
This is gonna be a hard one, man. Who do you think I listened to most? And we can't consider King's X a Christian band back then, can we?
No, probably not.
Man, oh man. So I am gonna go. Woo, dude, I'm looking at a ranker list and they have DC Talk at number 1.
Do they
Not agreeing
really?
with that. Not agreeing with that. Switchfoot's
No.
number 6. They should be much higher.
Yeah, they should.
Okay. I am gonna say I'm looking at the list right now, but I'm thinking, hey, Bleach 18.
Hey,
All
that's
right.
pretty good. I've got
Um,
Davey coming on here in a couple, and like Davey from Bleach coming on here
yeah,
soon.
yeah. The waiting's on here. I work with those guys right now. They're awesome. Um, favorite Christian band in the 90s. It's gonna have to be Striper. Like
Striper.
any Striper record, yeah, because Striper kind of was like at the end of things in the early 90s.
Yeah.
But I have to pick. Uh, I'd have to pick Striper.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sweet.
as a band.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, go ahead.
Number three, who's your favorite Star Wars character and why?
Oh my gosh. So, man, okay. Have you been watching The Mandalorian?
Yes, I love the Mandalorian.
Okay,
So good.
I'm in love with that character now.
Yeah.
Like,
He's amazing.
I think what they're doing on Disney Plus with him is fantastic. Did
It
you watch
is.
Andor? Did you watch
Yes.
Andor?
I've watched
So,
everything.
so Andor
Well,
was
yeah.
much darker,
It
right,
was.
and serious,
Right.
but incredible because it was like, hey, we're setting up this revolution. Wow. But man, that Mando, I watched that first episode last week. I just
Yep.
like
It was great.
with Baby Yoda with
Yep.
Grogu.
Grogu.
That's perfect. So right
It
now I'm
is.
really digging that. Yep.
Yeah, me too. All right, number four. Who do you consider to be the greatest guitar player of all time?
Oh Lord, have mercy. I just watched Nuno Betancourt put out
Oh
something that
gosh,
was nuts on YouTube.
he
They
is
put out a new
insane.
single
Yeah,
and the
I saw
solo
it. Yeah, it is. It's insane. Yep,
mind blowing. I transcribed,
absolutely.
like I found somebody that transcribed it, started learning it at like
Mhm.
400% slower speed
Yeah,
because I can't do
right.
it that fast. I
That
was
dude's
like, oh
insane.
my gosh. So favorite guitar player or best guitar player,
Greatest guitar player of all time.
greatest guitar of all. Man, oh, this could be. I mean, I mean, you're gonna. I have to say Hendrix,
Hendrix.
right? Because Hendrix influenced Stevie
He
Ray Vaughan.
did. You're right.
And then you got Stevie Ray Vaughan influencing John Mayer. And then you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah,
you
yeah,
just
I do.
follow that tree.
Right.
I you know I just think Hendrix kind of just you know there just wouldn't be modern guitar if it wasn't for him. So
Right. I
that's what I'm
agree.
saying.
All right, number five. I'm going to give you a chance to do a plug here. But if you could only eat at one restaurant for the rest of your life, what restaurant would it be? I already
Oh,
know the answer to this
okay.
one, but
Well, all right. So if y'all are listening, I'm in Morganton. There's a place called Mountain Burrito. Okay. And they are open currently Thursday through Sunday.
right,
So yes, I eat lunch there every
every
day. They're
that
open.
they're
And
open.
sometimes I go for a twofer. But
Mm,
it's if you could imagine a Chipotle, but way better, way better, way more creative
right,
salsas and
right.
sauces. And it's my favorite place because it's quick and it's
Hmm.
fresh, like
Yep, it
legit
is.
quick and fresh. So yeah, Mountain Burrito
You
number
even have a
not
dish
even
named
close.
after you.
Yes, I have.
You do.
We have. There's a couple of things there, but hey, that's a good example of a small business that
Right.
opened in a recession and has turned into like a staple of our town, you
Right.
know. And gosh, I love that place, man.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
it is
literally
good.
wish it was open right now. I would go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, brother, thank you again for being on the
Yeah, man. Love
podcast.
you,
It's
dude. This
been a
was good.
blast. Love you too, man.
This
Anything
was
else you want
fun.
to share before we go?
Nope, nope. I think I'd said it all.
Yeah,
So,
man, we
and
covered a lot.
yeah, man, this is great. I'd like to do this again sometime. Maybe
Yeah,
we can. Uh, there's just so many things we could
we
talk
could
about.
bring some other guys on from,
Yeah, it could go on forever.
it could.
You know, Yogi would be interesting because
Yeah,
he
he
has no
would.
filter. He'd be
Right.
fantastic.
He would.
He's
He
just
would.
a fantastic human. But we know so many good people that would do well here. But you know, but anyway, love you, bro.
Love
Appreciate
you too,
this.
man.
Yep.
Yep. Thank you, man. Take care.
Yep. Bye.
Bye. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed my time with Ricky Rod from Bombhouse Recording. I know Ricky and I spent a lot of time reminiscing in this episode, but there is a lot that you can take from this conversation, whether it be the importance of finding yourself some lifelong friends to go through life with, managing the whole work life balance, learning how technology and music really go hand in hand, or coming to understand that there is not a greater era in Christian music than the 90s. Links to Ricky's website will be in the show notes, so make sure you check that out. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you're listening on. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating and review. And if you're listening on Spotify, hit the follow button and the bell icon to be notified when new episodes are released. Take care, guys. See you next time on the Warrior Podcast.